Hello, everyone. I'm Bruce Ball. I'm VP of Tax for CPA Canada, and welcome to another COVID-19 tax update. In today's session, we're going to talk about the further tax deadlines that have been announced. As we've discussed in previous sessions and also on our website, we've been in discussion with CRA about the importance of further extensions and interest and penalty relief. And although it has taken a while, there is good news, and we're going to go through that today. Unfortunately, there's been some confusion as well. So we're going to try and highlight that and make it as clear as we can. There's still a few unanswered questions, and we'll highlight those. So where we do discuss those questions, we'll be providing updates later on our website. So with everything that's happening, we thought it was important to do a separate recording to talk about the deadlines because there are some considerations for sure, and we wanted to make sure it's as clear as it can be. So there were two announcements. First, on May 22nd, there was an announcement on the waiver of penalties, including late filing penalties and interest for certain personal returns, and we'll talk about that in more detail. This was actually relief on penalties and interest as opposed to a filing extension. So we'll explain the rationale for that as well, because the rest of the changes were an extension. So that includes corporation returns, trust returns, and it also covers other information returns, elections, certain designations, and information requests as well, responding to those. Now, there weren't really any changes to the payment extensions that were announced before, so we're really going to just focus on tax deadlines. And we'll start with the personal announcements first on interest and penalties. So as I said, there wasn't a tax extension per se for personal returns. So the deadline for T1 General, the returns for people who aren't self-employed remains June 1st. So that deadline stays in place. Also, although we had talked to CRA about an extension for self-employed returns, they remain due on June 15th as well. So how CRA has decided to deal with this is to provide relief for interest and penalties. So they're doing it that way as opposed to a specific extension. So the CRA has said essentially that penalties and interest will not be charged if payments are made by the extended deadlines of September 1st, 2020. This includes the late filing penalty as long as the return is filed by September 1st, 2020. So we'll talk about a few uncertainties around that one in a few moments, because we did have some questions that we did send the CRA, but that was the basic announcement that was made on May 22nd. Now, how the CRA has dealt with the self-employed returns, it essentially allows the same relief from interest and penalties for those returns as well, for the returns that would have otherwise, or that still remain, I should say, on June 15th. They're still due on June 15th. So just to go a little deeper on this, the CRA also confirmed, and where I'm getting a lot of this information is from the CRA's tax deadline summary. There's more information that was released along with the announcement, but the CRA confirmed that for deceased taxpayers, the 2019 return will have similar relief. So this would be a situation where it's due after its usual deadline and sometime before September 1st. So in those cases, again, as long as it's filed by September 1st, and apparently as long as the tax is paid by then, and that was one of the issues that we're trying to clarify, there won't be any interest or penalties. The other good news, and one of the questions that came up right away and was clarified again on the CRA's tax summary page, is the T1135 and other elections, forms, and schedules that you normally file with a T1. So the good news there is, again, penalty relief will apply if these are filed after the normal due date. So just to recap all this in terms of the general application, it works somewhat like an extension because you can file after the deadline and their provided conditions are met. There won't be any interest and penalties, but it is not a filing extension literally. So it will work a little bit differently, I guess, from the other ones that we'll talk about in a moment, just from the perspective it's not an actual extension. And that does raise a few concerns because if it isn't a straight exemption, it does get us wondering about some other issues, and I'll talk about those. So you might be wondering, why would they do it this way as opposed to some of the other changes I'll talk about after we're done with personal returns? The big issue really is the CRA is concerned about tax returns, especially for lower income individuals who have who are eligible for payment programs or income programs that are based on tax filings. So lower income individuals do get a number of payments. And the concern is that if they don't file a tax return, what will happen? Now, the CRA has said that they're going to continue paying income tested benefits over the summer based on 2018 returns if they don't have 2019 information. But the concern is that eventually they do have to move to 2019. And if they did a filing extension, will that mean that some returns that could otherwise be filed won't come in? So that is the issue. So they're hoping that these T1 returns will be filed as soon as they can, but for those situations where it's not possible to meet the filing deadline, the objective was to provide relief from interest and penalties. So that's kind of the rationale that we were going through. Now, I did say that there were some unanswered questions on T1. So we're waiting actually on a response. We gather CRA is still working on these. So we're going to post updates on our website as we get answers to some of these things. The one, probably the biggest question that we've received, and one I think we sort of were wondering ourselves before anyone even asked, is, so what happens if the T1 is filed by September 1st, but the tax isn't paid? Because the CRA announcement wasn't too clear on that. So as I say, we don't have an answer to that. We're expecting something soon, as I said. Another question, and again, this is because it's a relief from penalties and interest and not a filing extension per se, but the question was, well, you know, what happens? So let's assume this time we actually did file the return and paid the tax. But what happens if there's an adjustment after September 1st and I owe more tax? Since I did file the return late, does this interest and penalty relief include anything that happens afterwards as well? So again, that's another question we've asked. And from a procedural point of view, one of our concerns is what happens in terms of actually applying this relief? Will the CRA make sure that their systems are adjusted so interest and penalties won't arise? Because there's two parts to this. There's the part that you won't eventually, you know, at the end have to pay interest and penalties, but everyone's worried about whether they'll have to ask for an adjustment or something like that. So again, we've asked the CRA specifically to confirm that their systems will be adjusted so that the penalty and interest won't even come up in the first place. We're sure it'll get adjusted, but obviously we want it to happen automatically so there's no work that has to be done. So as I say, we'll post updates as we get them on these issues. So we'll move on to corporate returns. Now these were actual extensions, so that's the good news. I guess the bad news, unfortunately, was there's some uncertainty here as well, and I'll talk about that. And we're trying to both between our update today and our tax blog that'll get posted very soon, just provide as much detail as we can on some of the issues. So why don't we just start off with what the CRA said. So the announcement is a filing extension, so it's to September 1st, 2020. And it applies for a corporate return that is otherwise due in June, July, or August. So although that seems, excuse me, straightforward, There's a couple of issues that were unclear, and I'll walk through that in terms of what this otherwise due reference means. Now, also, and this is good news, the CRA has confirmed as well that the extension will apply for forms like the T106 and T1135, as well as any other elections, forms, or schedules that must be filed with the corporate return. So good news there. So we'll move on and talk about the uncertainty that I mentioned. There's, I guess, different ways one could interpret what otherwise due meant. So there were two issues, I suppose. First of all, we had a batch of returns that were already extended through the March announcement, and they were pushed forward and were due on June 1st. So I guess one issue was when they say otherwise due, did they mean otherwise before the March extension or otherwise before the second announcement? So on this note, the CRA has confirmed that otherwise due in June does not mean the returns that were extended previously. This is an extension for a new batch of returns. But there was still one other issue that was a bit strange, and I don't think anybody really picked up on this until we were getting closer to the deadline. Now, November 30th, 2019 returns are due on May 31st. So at first blush, you'd think, well, that's not included, but turns out May 31st is Sunday, and that advances the deadline under usual administrative rules to June 1st. The CRA has confirmed, this hasn't been posted yet, but they did confirm to us just before we did the recording, that the due date will be extended to September 1st for these returns because they were otherwise due in June without any help from the March extension. Now, I did want to talk about SR&ED really quickly. There is draft legislation that's been released, and if it's passed, it would give the CRA some powers to provide extensions for SR&ED. But the CRA really hasn't talked about how they're actually going to use that power, assuming the draft legislation is passed. So this will be another issue that we'll update on the website as we get more information. So we figured the easiest way maybe to just re-emphasize what I was just saying might be to do a chart with some deadlines and some normal month-end year ends, just as examples. So for September and October 2019 year ends, and I'm talking end of the month in all cases here, these would have otherwise been due March 31st and April 30th. So they qualify for the March announcement, and they were extended to June 1st, 2020. There'll be no further extension to those returns. So for November 30th, this is the issue that I was just talking about. It is May 31st, but it, as I say, gets a push to June 1st. And as I mentioned, the CRA has confirmed that these will be due on September 1st. And then we get into the returns that were clearly, within the parameters of what CRA was talking about. And these are the December 2019, January, and February 2020 year ends. So they were due at the end of June, July, and August, respectively, and they fall within the extension announcement as well. So they're now due on September 1st. There's also an announcement for trust returns. So this is again a specific extension. It works pretty, the deadline obviously for trust returns generally is different than T2s, but it works effectively in the same manner. Again, they've announced that there's a new batch of extensions for trust returns otherwise due in June, July, and August. So those will get extended to September 1st. Now, for one thing that has been raised, and I think it's just something that came out as part of the drafting. I've said here again, the CRA has stated that no late filing penalties and interest will apply if returns are filed by the due date and payment made, which is by September 1st. Some people have asked why they didn't make the same statement for corporations, and I think based on what I've heard, I think it was purely a lot of work being done to pull all this together, and it just was an omission when they drafted it. I wouldn't read anything into the fact that this statement was made for T1s and T3s, but not T2s. I think it's clear that if you extended the deadline to September 1st, that conclusion's a natural result. So I wouldn't read anything into the fact that they didn't say the same thing for T2s, and we did point that inconsistency out to them as well. So for the other piece here is, again, T1135, you get an extension for that as well if the trust is required to file that form. So it'll be due at the same time as the extended deadline for the trust return. So I wanted to talk about some final extensions, and these apply to other information returns, to elections, to designations, and other information requests that are made. So again, there was a little bit of uncertainty here. The English and French versions of the CRA tax deadline summary did not agree exactly, but we've been told that it applies basically in the same way as the other extensions. So the idea here is that this will apply to things that are otherwise due in June, July, or August. Now, one of the common questions that came up was what happens with partnership returns that are due on May 31st? How will that be dealt with? And it's the issue similar to what I was talking about for November 30th corporate year ends, because they were due on May 31st as well. The issue here, again, is that the 31st was on a Sunday. So what happens to those returns? And we were just told, and we didn't have time to update the slide to say this in the slide itself, but we've been told that the same rationale would apply to a partnership return that's due May 31st. And this should apply more generally as well. So the idea would be anything that's due in June, because of it falling on Sunday, May 31st, that'll push into the extension period. And that does include these partnership returns are due on May 31st. So these would be partnerships that have a December year end where the partners are corporations. So some more good news, although albeit a little late in the process for partnerships as well. So finally, I just wanted to reconfirm that we will continue to follow the issues as they arise and provide updates. As we talked about earlier during the session, there are still some unanswered questions and some things that do have to be posted and confirmed by CRA on the website, including the partnership issue that I just talked about. So we will provide updates on the site as these things happen. And we're going to continue working with the CRA as well on the SUS subsidy and other issues as they arise generally. We are in regular contact with them, and we'll continue that work. So on that note, I hope you found the session useful. We'll talk to you very soon, and in the meantime, stay well. Thank you.